What's going on, everyone? It's Indiano here, and in this episode of the podcast, I have the pleasure to have Luis from Freedom Pact. And during our conversation, you will be able to listen to Luis and I talk about how to have a successful podcast, how to have interesting guests, and also about purpose and self-improvement in three specific areas: health, wealth, and wisdom. So let's get into it. Well, I would like you to present yourself first, please.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for having me on. I'm a big fan of what you're doing. I love your Instagram account. I think the content you've got on there is fantastic as well, especially for your age. I was really impressed when I found out you were just 15. I think if I was doing what you're doing when I was 15, I'd probably be a lot further along with my life by now. But yeah, I run the Freedom Pact podcast. I think we're at about 150 episodes now. We've interviewed, successful businessmen to actors to authors to psychologists to just about anyone that I think can bring people value, and that's what it's all about.
Awesome. And well, now I would like to talk more about the journey of Freedom Pact and how did the idea came up.
Yeah, so the idea originally started because long before the podcast existed, me and my friend Joe, who I run the podcast with, we used to go on these nighttime drives. So Joe would pick me up in the car and we would just go for a drive and we'd talk about all the things we'd learned that week. So, maybe one of us would read a book and we'd tell the other one all the great things we learned in the book. Or if we'd listen to a podcast and we'd share ideas and we just, start with those ideas and then build on the conversations. And these conversations would go on for hours and hours. And I turned to Joe one day and I said, man, I think we should, maybe just record one of these conversations just for fun. And so one day we did that. We were in the car and I just pulled out my iPhone and I just clicked record on the voice note app and just recorded a conversation that lasted like 2 hours. And it was about the education system, I think it was about. And I listened to it back. I didn't want to upload it anywhere. And I just remember listening back and thinking, I wish I heard this conversation when I was a young boy. And I thought, well, maybe it can benefit other people. So I went back to Joe and I said, that conversation we had the other night, I think we should re-record it. But just present it a bit better and maybe upload it. And at first he wasn't really too fussed on the idea. I think he was a bit, had a bit of imposter syndrome, maybe a bit embarrassed to start a podcast. But I talked him around. I think it took a few weeks for him to say yes. We re-recorded it. We uploaded it. And yeah, I didn't do many listens at the start. Not many of them did, but that is how it started. It was just two friends having honest conversations, and we realized that these are the conversations we wish we'd heard when we were younger.
And how did you start to, well, upload more constant content to the podcast?
Yeah, so after that first episode, I think we left it a few weeks. So we had one episode for like three weeks. And then we'd slowly just, continue to have more ideas and more conversations and upload them sporadically. There was no routine to it. We just sort of uploaded when we liked or when was convenient. We had no schedule. And it got to a point where we started, attracting maybe like something small at the time, maybe like 30 listeners an episode. And we thought to take it to the next level, we needed to start coming up with some sort of consistency, some sort of plan. So we dedicated, I think, one episode every 2 weeks to start out, where I would come up with the topic and I would interview him about that topic. And then 2 weeks later, he would pick a topic and interview me. And I think we did our first 15, 16 episodes with just me and him before we even had a guest, because we couldn't get a guest at that point. And then from that point on, when we started uploading more consistently, we decided that the next step was to start getting guests. And that at the time was a really tricky thing because it's something I hadn't done, and networking wasn't a skill I'd really developed to that point. But I think, yeah, it was the right time to start getting guests on who could bring more value. And that was a new challenge in itself then.
And who was this first guest?
Okay, so our first guest was a motivational speaker from the UK called Cameron Parker. And that came about because, look, I think when everyone starts a podcast, you want to go to the Dean Graziosi straight away, right? You want to get the biggest names possible, but that's not always, possible. If you're having small listening figures, then these really successful people aren't going to come on your podcast. So I think the most important thing we realized early on was that we had to start slow, and we had to realize where we were. And so I went online, and we're from the UK, so I thought we might as well start local. And so I started looking up inspirational people in the UK. And there was a motivational speaker that was, doing tours of schools, and I checked out some of his content. And yeah, I resonated with a lot of what he was saying, and we got him on. I think it was over the phone originally we did the podcast, because before we started doing them from our house, we actually recorded in the car. I brought my laptop in the car, and we called off a mobile phone, and yeah, it was really poor quality at the time. Um, but yeah, that was our first guest, and then from there we made a rule where every new guest we got, we would try and raise the bar a little bit.
Cool. And well, so you started just doing it for fun, right? But then when you started having more guests and started having more clarity, what did you decided to be the purpose for Freedom Pact?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, purpose is a big thing to begin with anyway. I think that's one of the things you need to realize early on with your podcast is you want to define why you're doing it. No one's going to start a podcast and make money off of it in the first year. Um, you know, I know that might upset a lot of people to hear, but that's the reality. I think we've been at this for almost 3 years now, and it's only in the last year that we've started making noticeable money from it, really. And now we're at a place where we're fortunate enough to be doing that. But yeah, in that first year, so that was all about purpose and why we were doing it, and it was just simply to have the conversations we wish we'd heard when we were younger. And so we came up with a sort of motto that gave purpose to the podcast, and that is getting the information from the people who have it and giving it to the people who need it. And that is what we always told ourselves when we were looking for guests. We thought, right, what information do they have that we or our audience need? So that was the main thing. The second motto we gave ourselves was timeless ideas, transformational content, and optimize your life. So those are three big things we were thinking about when we were trying to attract guests. So ideas that had, stood the test of time, content that we think that people could take actionable advice from. So things they could start doing that night after listening to the podcast. Because there's nothing worse than when you listen to a podcast and they're saying all these amazing things, but you have nowhere to start or take action after listening. And optimizing your life. And that leads into our main motto, which is healthy, wealthy, and wise. And so those are the three areas that we base the podcast around. So our guests will fit into one of those categories. So healthy, we've had, neuroscientists, nutritionists, doctors that fit into that health side. Wealthy, we've had millionaire businessmen on that fit into that bracket. And wise, we talk to psychologists and philosophers and people of that ilk. So those are the three areas we try to cover. And that is really the purpose behind what we were doing in the first year before we started making any money.
Great. And well, I mean, doing the podcast also helps you, right? And well, it helps you to develop in these three areas you consider important, right? And well, now I am talking more about spiritual things, but I mean, I would like to know like your personal um, big perspective of life and why do you do all what you do?
I've spoken to Jay Shetty's teacher, his monk teacher, on my podcast, as well as another monk. So two monks, so Garanga Das and Gaur Gopal Das. And I spoke to them about this idea of service and why is the most important thing that you can be doing, not just for other people, but for what it does for yourself. And so I think that's a big thing when it comes to my podcast, because I think my version of serving is having the conversations I'm having and putting them out on platforms where people can listen to those conversations for free. So living to serve, I think, is a massive thing that plays in my mind when I think about the podcast. Another thing as well, I think I'm the type of person that needs to be creative. I can't think of anything worse than waking up in the morning, going to my job, coming home 8 hours later, and maybe sitting in front of the TV and doing nothing else. Because I think for me, I've always thought that if that's all you're doing, you're just sort of helping build someone else's dreams for 8 hours a day. And why would you not want to come home and build your own dreams or work on yourself? And you mentioned there, getting out of your comfort zone. I think that is one of the most important things you can do. Um, that's how you build a strong and resilient mindset, is by purposely putting yourself in situations that are uncomfortable. And if you there's no growth in comfort zones. You'll never grow as a person unless you put yourself in uncomfortable situations. And so I think, especially with the podcast, that is the thing, that is not always comfortable. I mean, I can speak to a millionaire businessman one day. I'm not a millionaire businessman, and so I don't know all the. I'm not an expert in all the things we're talking about. And then the next day, I'm speaking to a psychologist. I don't have a doctorate in psychology. These are uncomfortable conversations, and so I think that is a big thing that helps me grow as a person as well.
Yeah, and I mean, getting out of your comfort zone also helps you serve more, right? Serve other people more. And by serving other
Absolutely.
people, and well, this, what I'm going to say is a reflection that I have had, well, the last days. And well, by serving other people, you connect with your nature, right? I mean, we are
Mm.
social animals. And by connecting with your nature, you just connect to something bigger than you, and here you can call it God or the universe or however, but I mean, that's something inspiring, right? And makes you just want to live because you're gonna die. And well, actually, I'm telling you this because I would like to know your perspective on also that, since we are already talking about spiritual stuff. And well, this with the things you have learned and what you learned from the monks.
Mm. Yeah. Um, Again, one of the things that I talked to with the monks is with those two, Garangadas and Gorgopaldas, obviously serving was a massive one. Another one was uh, avoiding distraction. That was a massive one, takeaway I had from those conversations anyway. And the monks, they take themselves to the monastery. There's no distractions, there's no phones, there's no laptops, and that is on another level. And I'm not about to become a monk. That's not going to happen. But I can still take that concept for myself and not let myself get distracted by things, external things, and continue to focus and continue to control the mind. And also a big thing is not getting distracted by things that are outside of your control. If you can't control something, you shouldn't waste your time worrying about it. There's small examples. So if like someone cuts you off in traffic, um, you know, if you let that ruin and consume your mind and consume your day, then that makes no sense, because there's nothing you can do about it. It's already happened. And so wasting your time thinking about it isn't going to get you anywhere. And so just concentrating on the things you can control, as in your emotions, your mindset from that moment onwards after that happens, how you let that affect your driving, if we're going to go with that analogy, is what counts. So I think a big thing I took away from those conversations was, yeah, focusing on what you can control and focusing on yourself and not being distracted by things that are outside your circle of control and outside of your circle of concern.
Well, getting more into the part of the Freedom Pact, um, you mentioned that you now do monetize the podcast, and I would like to know how do you monetize it, and if you just started a podcast, how would you monetize it?
Yeah. Okay. So when you look into monetize, especially if you're in the infancy of your podcast, I think that you have to keep in mind a realistic view of where you are. If you're 10, 20 episodes in, you're not going to be making a lot of money if you are making any. But I think if you want the quickest route to monetization, from what I have found, it is to double down on YouTube. I think that is the easiest form of monetization. It's very easy to set up, and the metrics aren't too hard. I think to monetize, you need 1,000 subscribers and 4,000 watch hours, and then I think you can monetize on YouTube. And it is easy because once you're monetized, you don't have to worry about going out and looking for advertisers or partnerships. YouTube does all that for you, and they put the ads on your videos, and it's very easy. All you can control is how many ads you put on your videos, and that's a different conversation completely. But yeah, if you those metrics sound difficult. I mean, if you have no subscribers, 1,000 seems like a long way off, but it really isn't, because I'd say that going from 0 subscribers to 100 subscribers is way harder than going from 100 to 1,000. So when you get over that first 100 subscribers, that is the hardest thing, because from that point, everything starts to compound. Um, and you'll see them start ticking over slowly. And you're only ever one episode away from blowing up, where you can reach 1,000 nowhere. And if you're doing long form conversations like I know you and I are, then it's very easy to notch up 4,000 watch hours, because you think a podcast is an hour long, you just need 4,000 views really for the entire time, and that's really achievable. I think one thing to avoid when you're chasing monetization is avoid affiliate marketing where you can, especially if you're in your infancy, because I think the return on investment isn't great. And you can look a bit like a snake oil salesman when you're trying to tell someone, put this code in and you'll get 20% off, because it's really hard to get people to do that. And even when you do, you're going to make like a penny. You're not going to make much at all from affiliate marketing. So I understand people who do it when they've scaled up their podcast, but I think when you're starting off, I think you should avoid that. And I think if you do get to a point where you are working with brands, is to only work with brands you trust, because that's if you plug in a brand that you don't use, or that is a terrible brand, or something that's just a bad product, then that's the quickest way for your audience to just stop trusting you and stop tuning in. I'm not going to name any names, but there's some big personal development podcasts out there that I think are terrible when it comes to this. I think I've heard a podcast before, and the entire episode was about how you shouldn't eat red meat, and then all of a sudden the interview is cut off with an advert for a butcher box. So it's like, that is counterintuitive to what the podcast was about, and it just looks like you're selling out. And it's really transparent. So those are the things I'd say to avoid, and to double down on YouTube if you're looking to monetize as quickly as you can.
Yes, because by selling products you don't like, you start losing credibility, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
It's the quickest way to lose trust. And I think in something like podcasting, trust is everything, because the audience are trusting you to bring them guests that are worthwhile. They're trusting you to ask the important questions. They're trusting you with their time, and time, in my opinion, is the most valuable thing on the planet. And so if I've given you my attention and my time for an hour, and you're trying to sell me products that are just a scam, then you're going to stop getting my viewership.
Yeah. And well, lately I have been having contact with the next idea, and it is of creating info products of the podcast. So, for example, you record an interview or a simple podcast, and after that, you offer, but you don't make people buy it. You just offer um, the info product that would maybe help them take action from the episode. And I would like to know your perspective on that idea.
That's a fantastic idea, and one that I've not really thought about. That is a way in which you could use affiliate marketing. I think that's a fantastic idea. I mean, if you have a conversation on, let's think, for example, maybe like a health, you're talking to someone about health, and you're talking about certain supplements, for example, that might benefit their health in some way. And then at the end of the episode, you have a section where you talk about products that maybe were mentioned in the episode. And then that is a way of quickly affirming to the listener that what you're trying to sell back to them or get them to buy is something worthwhile because they've just heard an hour's conversation on why that is a good thing. So I think that's a fantastic idea that you're onto there, and I'd be interested to see that one in action, actually.
Well, you might see it soon
I
in my
look forward to
podcast.
it.
And well, so you have a you have a successful podcast, right? You have had great great authors and millionaires and people and experts, and I would like to know, well, first, how do you define success in Freedom Pact, and second, how to grow and create a successful podcast.
Okay, yeah. I think that the first thing I think is concerning guests. I think that is the, if you're running a podcast like you or I, it's all about guests, and that's where a lot of your traction comes from. That's where a lot of your future listeners are going to come from. That's how you build a following, is off of other people's names, really. So the first question I ask myself when it comes to guests is, who would I love to speak to? Because that's what's going to create the most valuable conversation and the most engaging conversation. There's nothing worse than listening to a podcast when the interviewer isn't that into it. Okay, so ask yourself, who would I love to speak to? The second question is, who can bring my audience value and actionable ideas? Again, we spoke about actionable ideas earlier. For me, when I'm running a interview, I like to try and get something actionable. So by the end of the podcast, the listener can say, okay, this is exactly what I'm going to go away and do right now. I can actually do this, rather than just being pretty ideas. So that's my second question. My golden rule as well, when it's for guests, is to say to yourself, nobody is too big to come on my podcast, because you're selling yourself short. And look, there's nothing wrong with you reaching out to Richard Branson, because you might think there's no way he's going to come on my podcast, but you can't hurt in trying, right? And I get more no's than I get yeses, and I get more people ignore my emails. But some of my biggest names have come from moments where I thought this is never going to happen, but I'll send the email anyway. And it goes back to that old saying, if you shoot for the moon, you're at least going to land somewhere among the stars. So shoot for the moon, man. If you're a big fan of someone who's really, really famous or has a big following and you think they're not going to give you their time, send the email anyway, because the investment is what? It takes a few seconds to send an email. And the return on that investment, if they say yes, could change the course of your podcast or your life. Another thing when it comes to guests as well, I think this is the biggest tip I can give you in reaching out to people, is there needs to be some sort of reciprocity. So you have to offer them something, or you have to make them convinced that there's some value in it for them, because there's not many people out there that will do things or invest an hour of their time as a favor. If you can tell them exactly how it's going to benefit them, they're more likely to come on. So, if if you convince them it's going to raise their profile or drive more traffic to their website, then it's more likely they're going to come on if they think there's something in it for them. And there will be something in it for them. You can get something out of any opportunity. And yeah, creating a system. So an email. If I don't know if that's how you reach out to most of your guests, but that's how I do it for mine. I have a template, and that email includes social proof. So I will mention in the first half of the email, I'll do a rundown of the 10 most notable names I've interviewed. And so, if I'm reaching out to an entrepreneur and they're reading down the list and they're going, wow, this guy's interviewed Patrick Bet David, Dean Graziosi, they thinking, okay, so it is worth my while because they've spoken to these guys. So there's that social proof in there. And yeah, another thing I'd say is get in and out of their emails as quickly as possible. So if they say yes, confirm a date and get out of there, because the longer the conversation goes on, the higher the chance that the person's going to maybe, decide this isn't for them. So get in and out as quickly as you can. So yeah, you mentioned how to grow your audience and make it a successful podcast. I'd say utilize every platform. I looked at your podcast before we started, and I noticed you're on YouTube, you're on Spotify. That's exactly what you need to be doing. I think I was 50 episodes deep before I even started YouTube, and that was a massive mistake I made. I neglected my probably biggest platform opportunity before we'd even got to like 60 episodes. So utilize every platform. The more places you can put yourself, the better, because you think of, there's YouTube, there's Spotify, there's iTunes, there's SoundCloud, there's Stitcher. There's probably platforms you've never even heard of that people listen to podcasts on. So just get them out everywhere you can, and follow up with your guests. I mean, like, follow up in terms of create content. So let's take, for example, you interviewed Evan Carmichael, right? That's a pretty big name. Now, if Evan Carmichael shares your episode, then that's going to get you a lot of views. I think your interview with him done like 10,000, man. That's really cool.
Yeah, on YouTube.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So, with someone like Evan, who's got a massive audience, you need him to reshare the content, right? So create content, create videos, create posts, and just tag them in it, man. Or follow up with an email saying, thanks again for the great value you brought. Build a bond with them, make them want to share the episode. And I'd say the most important part of growth outside of that is word of mouth. I know we live in a digital age where everything's about sharing and everything's online, but nothing is as good as word of mouth. If I listen to a podcast that's really good and I tell my friend to listen to it, that's the most powerful thing in the world. So I think that the way you go about that is trying to create the most impactful conversations you can, and conversations that people can benefit from, because they're going to share that then. And I think that's one of the most important things you can do as well.
Yes, it is all about adding as much value as possible, right? And well, now I would like to know who has been your favorite guest, or or which interview has been your favorite?
That's a tough question, man. I think there's been, I think that changes a lot, and I have different favorites for different reasons. So I think the first time I interviewed someone I was a really big fan of. So for me, maybe like 50 episodes in, I interviewed Robert Greene. Um, and I'm a really big fan of Robert Greene. I know my co-host is. And so that was like my favorite episode for a long time, because I was thinking, man, I interviewed Robert Greene. And that was like quite early on. And so that stuck out as a big milestone. But there's other episodes where, like, you'll interview people that maybe you'd never heard of before you picked up their book, and they surprise you when they come to the podcast. I think one that sticks in my mind is I interviewed a man called Nick Yaris, who's not a very popular name, but his story is so crazy. So he spent 22 years on death row in a prison for a crime he didn't commit. And so he spent 22 years in prison for no reason, and finally got out 22 years later. And I had this conversation with him about freedom and how it feels to live like a normal life, and how he reflects on it now. And that's a conversation that sticks in my mind all the time. But man, there's so many. I've got so many lessons from these conversations. I think they all tend to crop up in my mind at least once or twice a day, to be honest.
And what do you think has been your biggest lesson by interviewing? I mean, regarding a specific interview or just the journey of interviewing?
Yeah, so I'll give you both. I'll give you a few from both. If we start off with the journey of interviewing, I think the biggest thing I've learned is, and this one thing I'd love you to take on board with your podcast, never sell yourself short in terms of both your time and quality. So, for example, I once had a podcast booked in for quite late my time because I live in the UK and a lot of the people I interview are American. So you guys, your time zone is a little bit behind mine. So sometimes I have to stay up till like midnight to interview people. So it's quite an investment. And I remember one night it was like 11 o'clock at night, and maybe I had work in the morning, but I was going to stay up for this podcast. And the guy I was interviewing didn't turn up, and like 10 minutes went by. And so I sent him an email and I was like, is everything okay? And he said, look, I forgot. I'm out on my bike. I just forgot about it. Can we, maybe we can do it again sometime. And for me, I think in that moment, that is disrespectful in the sense that that tells me that the person thinks their time on this earth is more valuable than yours. And that is not the case. I don't care if you're the most successful person on the planet, or you can blow my podcast up. I think if you disrespect someone's time in a way like that, then I'm not gonna compromise myself or the respect I have for myself or something like that. So never sell yourself short on things like that. And also quality. Me and my co-host Joe have a saying when we do our podcast, is that we have this place called the bin. And if someone comes on the podcast and they give rubbish value, like the episode's not very good, then we put them in the bin and they never go out. And I'm not about to put an episode out that I think is bad just because the person has a big name and it might be good for my podcast, because I think that is a way your audience loses trust in you, because you want to bring them the best value you can, right? But if you start compromising, then that's not going to end well for you in the long run. So never compromise your time. Never sell yourself short on time or value. So, for example, I'm not saying it is the case, but if we ended this interview today and you thought, man, Lewis was terrible, like his interview sucked, that was terrible, I was boring, then don't put it out, man. Like, don't put it out. You're not obliged to put these things out. Because someone's invested an hour of their time, like you don't have to put it out if it's not good enough, or you don't think that represents your brand or your podcast well enough. So don't ever sell yourself short in that regard either. So yeah, those are some big lessons from the process. But from the episodes, I can get into some of the biggest lessons I've learned from the guests I've interviewed, if you want.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I've got a few that come to mind. So we'll go through them. The first one, I interviewed an author called Laura Vanderkam, and we talked about time and the fact that we have more time than we think. So what I got from that is that, like, we all tell ourselves stories like we're working around the clock, we have no time. And I think that everyone probably overestimates how long their work hours are in the grand scheme of things, because it's human nature when it involves something that you don't want to do to build it up in your mind like it was a really long time. And things like work tend to be structured, which sort of expands the time in our mental accounting. So like if you're at home and it's like leisure time, it has no structure to it. So like when you're watching the TV, you're not saying, I'm going to watch the TV from 1 o'clock till 1:45, and then I'm going to read from 1:45 to 1. So you're not scheduling it. And so that time seems to go a lot like faster because it's not like regimented. It doesn't have a structure to it. And our perception of time is sort of shaped by what we're doing with it. And if you're doing more memorable things that include, you know, like something intense or something that has risk taking, like doing this podcast, for example, they stand out more in your mind because like adult life is routine. So like when you commute into work, everything happens at the same time and it doesn't register in the brain. And so it sort of all collapses into this like memory sinkhole where the time feels like it didn't really, you didn't do anything with the time. Like it doesn't exist. Like 30 years, like, okay, maybe like 2 years from now, for example, you're not going to remember the shift you did in work on the 10th of November from 8 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. But 2 years from now, you might remember the fact that me and you had this conversation because it was something memorable. And so it feels like that time actually exists. And so that is a big thing. And like you can try and consciously put things into your life that are more memorable. So like small risks of doing things outside your comfort zone, which we already talked about. And they're the things you're going to remember because they're emotionally intense and your brain is going to hold on to it. And therefore, like it's going to have the effect that you're making more use of your time or the time is going a lot slower. So that is the one of the lessons that I try to remember is that we have more time than we think, and to not trick ourselves into thinking that there's not enough hours in the day. Um, Another big one is I interviewed a businessman called Brad Lee, and he talked about the importance of choices and that choices are everything in life. I think the quote he said to me was, if you show me someone who makes flawless choices, I'll show you the most successful person on the planet. And that's because the simplest of choices lead to the biggest things. Like everything you do. So like what you have for dinner, what time you get out of bed, what you do with your time for the next half an hour. Those might seem like little, like pointless choices, but they build up to the biggest things. And he taught me that every little thing that happens to you in life can be traced back to a choice you made. So that's what I think about. Even when I'm trying to make the smallest of choices, I try and think about where they're going to lead. Another big thing, I interviewed a member of the SAS, so the Special Forces in the UK, called Ollie Alton, and he came up with this framework called the Purpose Pyramid. And I'll explain to you what that is. So I use this pretty much every day now since interviewing him. And it's this framework that can tell you whether something deserves to be in your life or not. So it's called a pyramid because there are three questions. The first question is, do I enjoy it? The second is, does it help me? And the third is, does it help others? So let's go through some examples. Okay. Doing this podcast, do I enjoy it? Yeah, I enjoy it. Does it help me? Yeah. It helps me think. It helps me work on myself. And does it help other people? I hope so. I mean, if they listen and they take something from it, so that's 3 yeses. So I should keep that in my life. Now
Yeah, I
with
mean,
this
I am
technique,
learning right now.
exactly, man. So in this technique, you need 2 yeses for something to stay in your life. So let's take another example. Me binge eating chocolate, right? Let's think of that as something. Do I enjoy it? Yeah, probably. I mean, who doesn't? Does it help me? Not at all. It makes me feel bad. It makes me feel sluggish. I'm going to feel bad for the rest of the day. Does it help other people? No, because it puts me in this sort of drowsy, lazy state and I can't give my energy to other people. So that's only one yes out of the three questions. So now I try and remove that from my life. So anything that I bring into my life, I try and think of that purpose pyramid. So always ask yourself three questions. Do I enjoy it? Does it help me? Does it help others? If you get 2 yeses, keep it in your life. If you get less than two, get it out of your life. So that's a really important framework that I use. And the last one I'll talk about is something I mentioned already. I mentioned Nick Yaris when I spoke to him, who'd been on death row for 22 years for something he didn't commit. And I remember speaking to him and I was like, aren't you angry? Like, aren't you really mad that they wasted 22 years of your life? And he said, like, no, he said, I'd do it all again. Like I wouldn't change a thing, because the lesson I learned about freedom and what that means is more valuable than those 22 years of my life. Because every day when I get out of bed in the morning, that is like a miracle to me. Or when I come home at the end of the day and I see my wife sitting on the sofa and I go over and like give her a kiss on her head, he said that's like the most magical thing. And so he appreciates every moment of his life. And that's why I try to think of when I'm having a bad day, or if I feel like life is unfair, I think to myself, have some perspective, man. Like, you're waking up in a comfy bed every morning, in under a safe roof with people you love, and you're quite lucky in the grand scheme of things. So I think when you find a story like Nick's that gives you perspective on things that me and you take for granted, then that can really transform the way you think about life.
Yes, it does. And well, I have just two more questions. Well, first, as I said earlier to you today, I was listening in the morning to your interview with Graziosi,
Mhm.
and you were talking about shutting up the limiting voice, the
Mhm.
inner voice that stops you from going out of your comfort zone, right?
Yeah,
And well, I would like to know, what did you learn, but most importantly, what did you reflect from that conversation, from that part of the conversation?
absolutely, man. Well, I think if I apply this to myself, I think about it in terms of acting on sort of creativity. So for me, like doing this podcast, for example, I think creativity for a start is the most beautiful way that anyone can light up their life. So, don't deprive yourself of doing something, because that inner voice, I think, for you, for example, you right now, Emiliano, you're running this podcast is very creative. Your Instagram is very creative. um, and that's doing so much for you. That's keeping your brain firing. It's keeping everything firing. So it's a beautiful thing. And that inner voice that we talked about with Dean, I think that can be an inner voice of fear, mostly fear of ridicule, fear of failure, imposter syndrome. So, if we look at those three things, I think the first one, fear of ridicule, is a massive one, man. Like, I started this podcast when I was 21 or 22. I wanted to start a podcast when I was 17, but I was so scared because I was in school and university at the time, and I was so scared that my peers would see it, they would laugh at me, they wouldn't understand it, I'd get made fun of, and so I let that fear sort of rule me and stop me from doing something that is turned out to be really incredible for me. And so that inner voice can come from fear of ridicule. I think for yourself, how you're like 15, you must still be in school, right? So
Yeah.
like, if you let that fear of what your classmates might say if they saw your account or your YouTube or your podcasts, then you would never have started this thing that I think is probably really beneficial to you right now. I mean, you're reading books that didn't even hear of until I was like 20, man. So like, that is something that obviously you don't suffer with, or you got over quite quickly, as a fear of ridicule. And the fear of failure. I mean, I think the number one reason people don't start something is because they're scared of it not working out. And I understand that, but that's one thing. Unless you get over that, that's going to rule your life, and you might never know. Like, the odds are, for a lot of people, that yeah, you're probably going to fail most things you try. But with that failure comes lessons, comes resilience, and it's what me and my co-host say to each other all the time. We used to go through this phase where every night I'd say to him, "What did you fail at today?" And he'd tell me what he failed at. He'd say, "What did you fail at today?" And I'd say, "Well, I tried this and I failed." And unless we were failing at something, we knew we weren't trying enough, or we weren't trying enough worthwhile things. And so that's something you've got to get over. And again, imposter syndrome is a massive one, man. Like, you, for example, you're 15 and you spoke to Evan Carmichael. Like, you must have thought to yourself at some point, do I deserve to be talking to someone who's on this level. I'm only 15, but you got over that. You spoke to him, and the next time you spoke to someone else, I mean, I saw you interviewed Nick from Book Thinkers. You were probably a lot more confident, maybe going into those interviews, knowing that you managed to handle someone like Evan Carmichael. So that's chipping away at your imposter syndrome every time you do something. And I think that is probably the number one way to shut that inner voice up.
Whoa, I hadn't thought of it that way. And well, you were talking about fearing of other people's opinions, and I actually used to fear about what my friends and classmates would say about, I mean, my accounts and all that I am doing. But then I just decided to start telling others, and well, I started with my closest friends, and now I think most of my friends know, if not everybody. Um, but I mean, I am happy with that. And actually, one friend of mine is now my video editor, and I
Oh,
mean that's great.
yeah, man. That's a really brave thing to do, because you don't know how they could have reacted. Especially when you're young, people can bully you for things like that. So it's really, I admire you having that bravery to do that at such a young age, because I still suffer with it now, man. Like, my best friends all know what I do, but I don't like tell people really about it unless it comes up naturally in conversation. Because I'm sure there are going to be people that sort of don't understand it or laugh at it or joke. But yeah, man, to get over that is massively important, and especially at your age, I don't think I would have had the courage to do that while I was in school.
Thanks. And well, the last question is, what have you learned or applied recently that you could share to us?
Mm, yeah, I think for me at the moment it is just service. I know we spoke about that already, but I'm going through Jay Shetty's Think Like a Monk, and that's a question I ask myself a lot of. Um, Another one, I don't know if you've heard of the author Ryan Holiday,
Yeah.
but I'm really into Ryan Holiday at the moment and Stoic principles. So things like, we spoke about already, not worrying about things you can't control, or the way you give your energy to things. Don't give your energy away for invalid reasons. And I think that Ryan Holiday is really good at that when he talks about problems like ego, stillness, all these concepts from Stoicism. I'm really into at the moment. And so I think that maybe it's not a philosophy that a lot of people can live their entire life by, but I think that there's something in there for everyone. So I would encourage everyone to maybe get a little bit stoic.
Yes, I agree with that. And well, is there anything else you'd like to add before wrapping up?
No, man, I just think I just like to extend to yourself that, I mean, you're a fine interviewer. I think for your age,
Thanks.
it's really impressive, man. In my day job, I deal with a lot of children at your age, and I can't imagine any of those having the type of conversations you're having, reading the kind of books you're having. So I can only encourage you to carry on with what you're doing. It's extremely impressive, and I think you're probably going to go on to do some really big things with the attitude you've got. Um, I'm really honored that you asked me to be on this podcast. I think it's a fantastic concept. I love your page, and yeah, if anyone out there is interested in checking out my podcast, that is the Freedom Pact Podcast. You can get that on YouTube, on Spotify, iTunes, pretty much everywhere, like we already talked about. And I hope at least one person out there has got at least one thing from this conversation. If so, it's been a worthwhile conversation and one that I enjoyed a lot, Emiliano.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, Ken, and thanks to everybody listening, and thanks for your attention.
hello again, thanks for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed it and that you received value. I hope you learned something useful, and I think that what stands out the most to me are two things. First, to make your life about service by improving in your health, wealth, and wisdom, and also the part of prioritizing what you do, asking yourself 3 questions. Do I enjoy it? Is it good for me? And is it good for the others? And well, so let me know if you liked the episode and what you learned. And thanks again for listening. Peace.